Jordan May was 36 years old when the accident happened, and she was 37 years old when she opened her eyes in a hospital room in Nashville, Tennessee, on a Tuesday in March, and found that the world had continued without her permission for 10 months and 3 weeks. She had driven a pickup truck she bought herself. She wore her hair short and practical. She worked at a nonprofit that trained transitional age youth in construction trades, a job that paid modestly and mattered completely, and the people who knew her by sight, but not by history, would have told you she was quiet, capable, the kind of woman who carried her own weight and never mentioned it. She had been an intelligence analyst with the United States Army for 11 years before her honorable discharge. She had spent 4 of those years overseas, and 3 of them reading patterns and information that other people had dismissed as noise. She was, by any professional measure, one of the best at finding what was hidden in plain sight. She had not stopped being that person the day she left the service. She had simply stopped being paid for it. Her husband Calvin had visited the hospital 41 times during the first 3 months of her coma. Then, the visits had become less frequent. By month 7, her sister Lorraine had noted in the journal she kept beside the bed that the last visit had been 19 days prior. What Calvin did not know, what the woman named Tasha, who had moved into Jordan's house by month 8, did not know, was that Jordan's sister Lorraine had been keeping that journal in precise and dated detail since the first week, and that Jordan, when she woke, would read every entry in a single sitting and make exactly 1 phone call before she said a word to her husband. The child was 4 months old when Jordan came home. By the time Calvin understood what was coming, it was already done. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The last morning Jordan remembered before the accident was an ordinary one. She had been up before the sun, which was her habit from the military, and one she had never been able to break, even when she wanted to. She made coffee in the kitchen of the house she and Calvin had bought together in East Nashville 3 years into their marriage, a craftsman bungalow on a corner lot with a porch that ran the full width of the front and a backyard large enough for the raised beds she had been building one by one every spring, adding sections as her time allowed, filling them with the things her father had grown: collard greens, tomatoes, sweet peppers, 2 varieties of bean he had favored and taught her to favor. Her father, a man named Cyrus May, who had worked 30 years in residential construction in Nashville and built the house Jordan grew up in with his own hands on a lot he had owned since before she was born, had told her 2 things she had carried with her through 11 years of military service and everything that came after. The first was that a patient woman was a dangerous woman, because patience meant you were still watching when everyone else had looked away. The second was that anything built on a false foundation would eventually show you the truth of it. He said you did not need to chase the truth. You only needed to wait for the weight to come down. He had died her 2nd year overseas, from a heart event that was brief and without warning, and she had not been able to come home for the service, and that grief had lived in her like a stone in a wall ever since, present and load-bearing and never discussed. She and Calvin had met at a community dinner her nonprofit hosted the first year she worked there. He was a contractor who had donated materials for the program's training site, and he had come to see how they were being used, which she had respected. He was broad-shouldered and unhurried, and he had a way of asking questions that made her feel he actually wanted the answers, which was not as common as it should have been. They had dated for 2 years before she accepted his proposal, because she was methodical about large decisions, and Calvin had understood that and waited without complaint. The first years were good. He was dependable, present, warm in the particular way that felt like shelter. She had thought, more than once during those early years, that she had finally built the right thing in the right place. She noticed the change in him the way she noticed most changes. late, because she had been trained to look outward and had not applied the same standard inward. It was small things at first. The phone screen tilted. The evenings that ended earlier than they used to. A name mentioned once and not again. She had catalogued these details in the back of her mind the way she catalogued everything, not drawing conclusions, simply noting. The morning of the accident, she had been driving to a supplier's warehouse on the east side. A driver ran a red light at an intersection she had crossed 200 times. The impact was on the driver's side. She did not lose consciousness slowly. She simply was awake, and then she was not. And the space between those two states held 10 months and 3 weeks of the world moving forward without her. She woke to the sound of Lorraine's voice reading from a book. The room smelled of antiseptic and the particular flatness of recycled hospital air. The light was thin and gray. She did not try to speak immediately. She lay still and took inventory of what she could feel and what she could not, and when she was satisfied she understood the inventory, she said her sister's name. Lorraine was at her side before the word had fully left her mouth. She was brought slowly forward over the following days. The medical staff explained what had been repaired and what was healing and what would take time. She listened to all of it with the complete directed attention that had always characterized her. She asked specific questions. She noted the answers. She did not cry, which the nurses commented on among themselves as remarkable, and which was simply, to Jordan, the appropriate response to information that required processing. She asked for Lorraine on the third day, when the room was quiet and the overhead lights had been dimmed for the evening. Lorraine brought the journal. It was a composition notebook, college ruled, the kind you bought at a drugstore, and Lorraine had filled 214 pages in a handwriting that started large and loose in the early weeks and grew smaller and more controlled as the months passed, as though the weight of what she was recording had compressed her. She had dated every entry. She had written times. She had written who visited and who called and who stopped doing either of those things. Jordan read the full journal in one sitting. It took her 4 hours. She did not ask Lorraine to leave. She did not ask Lorraine to stay. Lorraine sat in the chair beside the bed with her hands folded in her lap and did not speak, because she had written every word in that notebook and already knew where it ended. Calvin had visited 41 times in the first 3 months, which averaged to once every 2 days, which was the pace of a man who was present but managing the distance. The visits had declined to twice a week by month 4. By month 5, Lorraine had noted that he had begun arriving later in the day, leaving sooner, answering the nurse's questions about Jordan's status, with a brevity that Lorraine described as efficient, but not tender. There was an entry in month 5 that Lorraine had written and then crossed out, and then written again in a different part of the page, which Jordan read in both versions. The crossed-out version said she didn't want to think what she was thinking. The rewritten version said she was thinking it anyway. By month 6, a woman named Tasha had appeared once in the parking lot when Lorraine arrived, getting into Calvin's car. Lorraine had written down the make of the car, the time, the direction they drove. She had not mentioned it to Calvin. She had written it down. That was what Lorraine did with things she could not yet say out loud. By month 7, Lorraine's entries noted that Calvin had stopped discussing Jordan's anticipated recovery in terms of when, and had begun using language like "if she improves" and "when we know more," which was a shift in grammar that Lorraine, who was a high school English teacher and noticed such things, had underlined twice and written beside, "He has already made a decision." By month 8, he had moved Tasha into the house. Lorraine had learned this from Mrs. Hargrove, the retired neighbor on the corner, who had called Lorraine directly, because she did not have Calvin's number, and she thought someone in the family should know. Lorraine's entry from that day was 3 sentences. The third sentence said, "I did not tell the nurses. I did not know what telling them would accomplish. I told God and came back the next morning because Jordan is still here, and that means something is not finished yet." Jordan read that sentence twice. The child had been born in November. Lorraine had found out through the same neighbor 3 weeks after the birth. She had not recorded how she felt about it. She had recorded only the facts, which Jordan understood was the greatest act of love Lorraine had extended to her across the entire 214 pages, because Lorraine had swallowed all of it so that Jordan could encounter it plainly, without the additional weight of someone else's grief. Jordan finished the journal. She set it on the bedside table. She looked at the ceiling of the room for a long time without speaking. The room was very quiet. She could hear the equipment in the hallway and the distant sound of a cart being wheeled and the ordinary persistent sound of a hospital being a hospital. She was an intelligence analyst. She had read worse reports than this one. She had sat with worse information than this and been required to produce an assessment before she was allowed to feel anything about it. That training did not make this easier. It simply gave her a structure to move through it. The way a load-bearing wall gave a structure a way to move the weight without collapsing. Then, she asked Lorraine for her phone. She did not call Calvin. She called an attorney named Beverly Okafor, whose number she had found through a referral from a fellow veteran she trusted, who had described Beverly as the kind of attorney who worked quietly and did not need to make noise to win. Beverly picked up on the second ring. Tools were meant to work, not shine. Beverly Okafor practiced family law in Nashville from an office on Charlotte Avenue, the walls of which were lined not with diplomas, but with framed letters from clients whose names she kept confidential, which Jordan found a more persuasive credential. She drove to the hospital the following morning with a leather portfolio and a legal pad, and the manner of a woman who had heard most things and was still capable of listening to all of them. Jordan told her what she knew from the journal. She told her what she knew from her own observation, the changes in Calvin in the year before the accident, catalogued with the same quiet discipline she had applied to everything. She described the phone screen, the name mentioned once, the evenings that ended early. She described the visit log. She described the timing of the child's birth against the timeline of her accident. Beverly listened without interrupting. She asked 4 questions. The first was whether Jordan and Calvin had a prenuptial agreement. They did not. The second was whether the marital home was in both names. It was, with Jordan's name listed first, because she had arranged the financing. The third was whether Jordan was aware of any assets Calvin held independently. She was not certain, but she had a number for her Uncle Roosevelt in mind, her father's brother, the man who had handled Jordan's financial affairs by power of attorney during her incapacitation, and she believed Roosevelt could account for what had and had not moved during her absence. The fourth question was whether Jordan had documentation of Calvin's behavioral shift prior to the accident. Jordan reached into the bag Lorraine had brought from home and produced a small personal notebook, 3/4 full, dated entries beginning 14 months before the accident. She had kept it out of the same habit she kept everything, not expecting to need it, simply unable to operate any other way. Beverly looked at the notebook. She looked at Jordan. She said, "I want you to rest this week." She said she would begin pulling records and that she would be back on Thursday. Jordan said she could rest and think at the same time. She said she had been doing that for 11 years. Beverly returned Thursday with Gerald Suggs, a forensic accountant who had worked with her on 4 prior cases and who arrived with a printed request for financial disclosure forms and a quiet, unflappable demeanor that Jordan immediately recognized as professional discipline under pressure. She had worked beside people like Gerald for a decade. She knew what it looked like when someone had been trained not to let their face carry information that should stay in the file. Gerald shook her hand, sat down, asked 2 orientation questions, and opened his portfolio. He did not make small talk. Jordan appreciated that. Beverly had already pulled the public property records for the marital home and the joint account statements from the period of Jordan's incapacitation. Working from the financial power of attorney documentation her uncle Roosevelt had provided, she laid them out on the tray table beside the hospital bed in a sequence that Jordan recognized as deliberate, not chronological, but architectural, arranged so that each document supported the next the way courses of brick supported one another. Gerald's preliminary review identified 3 areas of concern. The first was a home equity line of credit that Calvin had opened against the marital home 4 months into Jordan's coma, drawing $47,000 in 2 installments over a period of 6 weeks. The second was a personal account Calvin had opened in his name, only at a different institution, into which the home equity draws had been deposited in full. Gerald noted that the deposits had occurred within 48 hours of each draw, which was the pattern of a man who had planned the sequence in advance rather than making it up as he went. The third was a change to the homeowner's insurance policy executed in month 6 of Jordan's coma, which had removed Jordan as a named insured and substituted Tasha's name in her place. This change required a policyholder's signature. Beverly placed the insurance document on the table and indicated the signature line without comment. Jordan looked at the signature. She looked at it for a measured amount of time. She said it was not her signature. She said she could demonstrate this with any number of comparison samples from the preceding 10 years, including the power of attorney document itself, which bore her genuine signature, and which Roosevelt had certified before a notary 30 days before her accident. Beverly said she had already noted the discrepancy and had retained a document examiner who would submit a formal analysis. Jordan received all of this without expression. She had been briefed on worse information in worse rooms and been required to produce a coherent operational response within the hour. That training did not make this easier. It made it possible, which was a different thing and sufficient. An irregularity, properly documented, was not a problem. It was a key. Her uncle Roosevelt confirmed, when Beverly's assistant reached him by phone that same afternoon, that he had not authorized any home equity transaction during his tenure as power of attorney, and that the document purporting to bear Jordan's signature for the insurance modification was executed on a date he could place precisely, because he kept his own records, during which Jordan had been in a medically documented state of unconsciousness, and he himself had been sitting 3 feet from her bed at the time the document was allegedly signed. He said this flatly and without agitation, the way a man who had been waiting for the right moment to say something useful said it when the moment finally arrived. Beverly filed the petition on a Friday. The filing included the home equity disclosure, the insurance document, Gerald's preliminary forensics summary, the power of attorney records, the hospital attendance log from Lorraine's journal formatted as an exhibit, and a physician's affidavit confirming Jordan's medical status on the date the equity documents had been executed. She also filed a motion for an emergency freeze on the jointly held marital assets pending the outcome of the proceedings. Calvin received service on a Monday morning. He called Jordan that afternoon for the first time since she had woken up. She did not answer. The reckoning was held in a conference room at Beverly's office on a Thursday morning 10 weeks after Jordan's discharge. Calvin arrived with his attorney, a man named Dennis, who practiced out of a firm in Brentwood and who had reviewed the filing over the preceding weeks with, according to Beverly's contacts, increasing dismay. Tasha was not present. Jordan had not expected her to be. The proceeding was not about Tasha. It never had been. Jordan arrived first. She sat with Beverly on one side and Roosevelt on the other, Roosevelt in the same dark suit he wore to every occasion that required a suit, his large hands folded on the table in front of him, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who had agreed to be present because his presence was required, and who required nothing from this room in return. Calvin sat down across the table. He looked at Jordan. Something moved across his face that might have been regret, and might have been the recognition of how thoroughly he had miscalculated. She did not try to read it. She had stopped reading his face 14 months before the accident, when she understood the face and the man behind it had diverged too far to reconcile. Beverly placed the forensic summary on the table. She walked through it in sections. The home equity draw. The personal account. The document irregularity. She spoke in the measured, organized way of someone who had arranged the information not for drama, but for clarity, because clarity was the thing that left the least room for argument. Dennis reviewed each page as Beverly addressed it. He made notes. He did not interrupt. When Beverly was finished, she placed a second document on the table. It was a full asset disclosure, prepared by Gerald, of what Jordan owned independently of the marriage. Holdings she had accumulated through 11 years of military service, careful investment, and a series of small decisions made over a long period of time, with the kind of disciplined patience her father had described as the only real wealth strategy. The number at the bottom of the disclosure was $418,000, held across 4 accounts and 1 property in her name alone. Calvin had not known about any of it. He had spent 10 months operating in a house he believed he understood completely, making decisions about a life he assumed he had full inventory of. And he had been wrong in the way that people who had never been trained to look carefully were always wrong. They saw the surface and mistook it for the depth. Beverly said the petition addressed 3 remedies. Return of the $47,000 drawn from the joint equity line, plus interest, plus damages for the document irregularity to be determined by the court. A revision to the marital asset division to account for the dissipation of jointly held value, and referral of the insurance document to the district attorney's office for review as a potentially fraudulent instrument, which Beverly had already initiated as a parallel action and which Dennis was now learning about for the first time. Dennis asked for a recess to consult with his client. Beverly said of course. Calvin looked at Jordan one more time before he stood. He said her name. He said he was sorry. He said it in the voice she had once thought was the most genuine thing about him. Jordan looked at him steadily. She said, "You chose to believe that because I was quiet, I was not watching." She said that was the only mistake that mattered. She said nothing else. She gathered her things and walked with Roosevelt into the hallway, and they stood together by the window at the end of the corridor where the light came in over the city, and Roosevelt put his hand briefly on her shoulder and did not say anything, which was the right thing. The settlement was finalized 7 weeks later. The $47,000 was returned in full. The marital property division was revised in Jordan's favor. The district attorney's office opened a preliminary review of the insurance document, which remained active, and which Dennis had advised Calvin not to discuss publicly. 14 months later, Jordan Cyrus May, she had added her father's name to her own at the county clerk's office on a quiet Tuesday morning, which felt like the right kind of ceremony, was standing in the backyard of a house she had purchased in East Nashville with the settlement proceeds and 6 months of careful search, a house with a corner lot and enough yard space for the raised beds she had transferred, one by one, from the old place with the help of Lorraine and Lorraine's husband, and the neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, who had come with a shovel and a casserole dish and no requirement of explanation. The beds were producing again. The collards were tall and dark, and they moved in the early morning wind with the particular heaviness of things that had put down real roots. The tomatoes were coming in. The beans her father had favored were climbing the cedar stakes she had cut and set herself. A man named Thomas, who had been introduced to her by a colleague from the nonprofit and who taught history at a high school 2 miles from her house, had started joining her on the porch on Sunday mornings without it becoming a conversation that needed to define itself. He brought his own coffee. He read. She read. Sometimes they talked for an hour. Sometimes they sat in the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood that stillness was not emptiness. Calvin had moved out of the East Nashville house and into an apartment in a suburb to the south. The preliminary review by the district attorney's office had not resulted in charges, but had resulted in a period of scrutiny that Calvin's contractor colleagues had noticed and commented on. Several contracts he had expected had gone to other firms. The woman named Tasha had moved back to her family in Birmingham before the settlement was finalized, taking the child with her. Lorraine heard these things through the network of people who told Lorraine things, because Lorraine was the kind of person people told things to. And she mentioned them to Jordan over dinner one evening the way you mentioned completed work, without ceremony. Jordan nodded. She had thought of her father's words, "You did not need to chase the truth. You only needed to wait for the weight to come down." The weight had come down exactly where it was always going to. She was free. She was home. She was building again. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.